Would you pray with me? Source and sustainer and cherisher of all, God, all compassionate, all merciful, all wise, fathomless well, brimming fountain, dwelling place, life of the world. As a new year opens before us, we give thanks for the vision and generosity of those who have guided our school to this moment, and especially for the women who 50 years ago came here to study and changed our school forever. We pray to be worthy of their courage and commitments, and as we welcome a new class of women and men to HDS, we give thanks that this community is never finished, never complete, never closed. We give thanks for the work ahead this year and ask for the imagination, audacity, and humility we need to do it well. May our reading and our writing, our preaching and our teaching, our conversation and our arguments be for us ways of loving the world. May our life together take its shape this year from our deepest questions, our fiercest hopes. With gratitude we pray. Amen.
It's my great honor and pleasure to welcome all of you here for what is the 190th year of education in the Harvard Divinity School and, of course, the 370th year of education in Harvard University. It's a privilege and a pleasure to see everyone here, to welcome deans and colleagues from other faculties who have joined us, as well as our community and all of our friends and guests. Thank you and enjoy the afternoon.
Thank you, Bill, for that introduction, and thank you for your splendid leadership of this school. It's a great honor for me to be here today. The annual Divinity School Convocation is a tradition that traces its origins to the founding of Harvard College, in large part as a hedge against an illiterate ministry. I am pleased to join Dean Graham and others in welcoming all in the Divinity School community to a new academic year. I'm particularly pleased to have this chance to participate in the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the admission of women to the Divinity School. I'd like especially to acknowledge and thank Ann Braude, the director of the Women's Studies and Religion program and senior lecturer in American Religious History, who will be speaking in a few moments, for her leadership and hard work in coordinating the year-long celebration to mark this important milestone. Thank you, Ann, for everything that's going to happen this year. This moment in Harvard's history and in the Divinity School provides us with an opportunity to reflect upon the progress we've made in the university towards greater gender equality and to remind ourselves that there is much work to be done. As you can imagine, this is a subject on which I've had substantial occasion to reflect over the last year, reflect in a variety of different directions and with a variety of different objectives. As a university, we've spent a great deal of time, as certainly have I, in reflecting on issues relating to the role of women in the academic life and in this university. The task force on women faculty, chaired by Professor Evelyn Hammonds, who is here with us today in her new role as Senior Vice Provost for Faculty Development and Diversity, made a series of recommendations concerning a variety of measures we need to undertake as a university if we are to enhance the diversity of the faculty ranks at Harvard across all fields and to improve the climate and prospects for faculty and students once on campus. I see here also Dean Drew Faust from Radcliffe, and I want to thank her for all her continuing efforts on these crucial areas. In many ways, and in some very important respects, the Divinity School has been ahead of the game at Harvard. Though the first women were not admitted to the school until 1955, they constituted a majority of its students by the 1980s. Perhaps as important, with the founding of the Women's Studies and Religion program in 1973, the school recognized that gender equity, and was among the first to recognize that gender equity was not simply a matter of numbers, but rather an important focus of scholarly inquiry. As Anne wrote to me in a letter describing the program, eliminating barriers to women's advancement requires delving into the deepest levels of culture, thought, and values. For the past 3 decades, and perhaps before that, scholars in association with the Divinity School have produced a very impressive body of literature exploring many aspects of gender and values. To take just a few examples, issues of motherhood in the state, women's involvement in religious movements in Africa, Bangladesh, and the Sudan, religion's intersection with political movements in Iran, and religious healing are just a few highlights of the many research projects supported by the Divinity School through its various research centers. The continuing work of Elizabeth Schuster Fiorenza on feminist approaches to understanding the New Testament, of Anne Braude on women's role in America's religious history, the work we look forward to from new arrival Amy Hollywood on many aspects of feminist studies, including both contemporary questions and those of the medieval period, are all part of the ways in which the Divinity School contributes to our understanding of gender and society and gives us a perspective that we would not get anywhere else into the changing political and cultural landscape of the world around us. You know, I was thinking about that period 50 years ago when women were first admitted into the Divinity School. And by the way, it was 50 years ago that I was born. And asking myself what people would have predicted as defining developments of the subsequent half-century. And some of what they would have predicted would have come true. They would have predicted some kind of remarkable revolutions in science and technology, and they would have been right. They would have predicted that America would make significant progress on civil rights and issues of race, and they would have been right. They would have predicted that much of the history of the next 50 years was going to be defined by a struggle between capitalist democracy and communism, and how that struggle played out, and they would have been right. But I think there are two very central aspects of the last 50 years that they would have been astonished by. The first is that if asked to predict what the role of religion in society would be, they would have explained that with rising prosperity, rising education, the likelihood was of secularization and a decreasingly salient role for religion in this country and around the world, and they would have been completely wrong. And in that year, when the labor force participation rate of married women had fallen to an extremely low level, not just far lower than its level in World War II, but far lower than its level in the first half, many parts of the first half of this century, I don't think they would have predicted the remarkable changes in the role of women in every aspect of society in this country and around the world. And so what it is that we are talking about today is something that is enormously important. And I believe that these two questions, the role of women in our societies, the role of religion in our societies, and very much how they come together, are going to be very defining in ways of the next half century, and at least now we will know that these very large issues lie ahead of us. Thank you very much for the chance to be here.
The first reading is from Phyllis Tribble, Text of Terror. As a critique of culture and faith in light of misogyny, feminism is a prophetic movement examining the status quo, pronouncing judgment, and calling for repentance. This hermeneutic engages Scripture in various ways. One approach documents the case against women. It cites and evaluates long-neglected data that show the inferiority, subordination, and abuse of the female in ancient Israel and the early church. By contrast, a second approach discerns within the Bible critiques of patriarchy. It upholds forgotten texts and reinterprets familiar ones to shape a remnant theology that challenges the sexism of Scripture. Yet a third approach incorporates the other two. It recounts tales of terror in memoriam to offer sympathetic readings of abused women. As a paradigm for encountering terror, story offers sustenance for the present journey. To tell and hear tales of terror is to wrestle demons in the night without a compassionate God to save us. In combat, we wonder about the names of the demons. Our own names, however, we all too frighteningly recognize. The fight itself is a solitary and intense fight. We struggle mightily only to be wounded. But yet we hold on, seeking a blessing, the healing of wounds and the restoration of health. If the blessing comes and we dare not claim assurance, it does not come on our own terms. Indeed, as we leave the land of terror, we limp.
The second reading is from Rifat Hassan, I Am a Woman. I am a woman with the eternal heart of a woman, who, like Othello, loved not wisely, but too well. I am a woman with the eternal heart of a woman, living in a world in which the rules are made by men, and where men can break all the rules and yet be gods, saviors and saints, martyrs and heroes, but where if women break the rules made by men, broken by men, they cannot live without being shamed, slandered and abused, beaten and hurt, scourged and stoned, burned and buried alive and damned. I am a woman with the eternal heart of a woman, born to love, living in a world in which when men love, they are called princes and knights, poets and mystics, or at the worst, perhaps, lunatics. But when women love, then love becomes a mortal sin for which they must give up their life. For when a woman is guilty of a mortal sin, the sin of loving, then she must die, so that the jealous God of love may be at peace. I am a woman with the eternal heart of a woman, living in a world in which there are a number of men, and also some women, who cannot love. And since love is what makes us human and gives us life, these men and women are callous and cold, cruel and cowardly, though they wear the masks of sages and madonnas and cherubs. And they are always ready to strike my eternal heart, because I dare to live in love. I am a woman with the eternal heart of a woman who has endured so many births and so many deaths, so that the seed of life and love may not be destroyed by those who, in the name of the God of love, who does not love, want to create a loveless world, a lifeless world, full of tombs, where one cannot hear the sound of life, the laughter of a little child, warm from the womb, who wants to live and wants to love, and to whom an eternal-hearted woman is what God should be. I am a woman with the eternal heart of a woman, and though I may be tormented and abandoned, dishonored and disowned, scourged and flogged, stoned and burned and buried alive, I will never be a martyr. I will never be a victim. I will never be a loser. I will always be a survivor. I will always be a winner. I will always be triumphant. For though I go, I will return. And though I die, I will live again. Forever and forever. For I am a woman with the eternal heart of a woman, and since my heart is made of love, and love is eternal, embodied in creation, leading to resurrection, though all else will burn with the funeral pyre in the flames of the fire, my eternal heart will never to ashes turn, and like a phoenix I will rise again, and like a phoenix I will be reborn.
It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you my colleague, Professor Anne Braude, as this year's convocation speaker. Dr. Braude is the director of the Women's Studies in Religion program and senior lecturer on American religious history at Harvard Divinity School. In addition to directing the Women's Studies in Religion program with great expertise and enthusiasm, she teaches courses on the religious history of American women. Before coming to Harvard, Anne served as associate professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Macalester College, and before that in the same position at Carleton College. Dr. Braude has held visiting appointments at Princeton University, the University of Cape Town, and in Harvard's Faculty of Arts and Sciences. She received an A.B. from Vassar College, an M.A. from the University of Chicago, and her doctorate from Yale University. Professor Braude's scholarship takes on questions of tremendous significance for how we understand the American past, clarifying with subtlety and historical imagination the often complicated relationship between feminism in its different waves and religion. She aims, as she says, to historize both the presumed antagonism of religion and feminism and their presumed sympathy. Professor Braude is among the most gifted writers in the study of American religions. Her directorship of the Women's Studies in Religion program is path-breaking, and her teaching is essential to the program in American religious history at Harvard Divinity School. Her work has earned her highest praise from her students and great enthusiasm from the visiting scholars in the Women's Studies in Religion Associate Program. Dr. Braude's first book, Radical Spirits, Spiritualism and Women's Rights in the 19th Century America, now in its second edition, explores the overlap between the early women's rights movement and the unconventional religious movement that viewed contact with the spirits of the dead as proof of the immortality of the soul. Dr. Braude is also the author of Women in American Religion, the first history of the religion of American women for a general audience. She has published many articles on women in Judaism, Christian Science, and American religious life, and served as co-editor of Root of Bitterness, Documents of the Social History of American Women. In 2002, Professor Braude organized a historic conference at which 25 pioneers of religious feminism told the stories of their path-breaking efforts. The conference resulted in a book entitled Transforming the Faith of Our Fathers, Women Who Changed American Religion. Yale University's Center for Religion and American Life awarded Dr. Braude an advanced fellowship for her current research on religion and the feminist movement. Professor Braude was a featured speaker at the 2001 conference, Generations of Giving, Women, Faith and Philanthropy, and at Middlebury College 2002 Scott Symposium. She was a keynote speaker at the conference on Women and American Religion, Reimagining the Past at the University of Chicago Divinity School in 2003, as well as the 2004 meeting of the National Association of Women in Catholic Higher Education. She serves on advisory boards for the Womenist Scholars Program at the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta and the Encyclopedia of Women and Religion in North America, as well as the Mary Baker Eddy Library for the Betterment of Humanity in Boston, Massachusetts, where she also serves as a moderator of America, the spiritual series of live webcasts. We owe it to Dr. Braude, as President Summers already said, to Dr. Braude's initiative that Harvard Divinity School is celebrating this school year the 25th anniversary of the Women's Studies in Religion program, as well as the very short 50 years of women's academic presence and citizenship at HDS, very short in comparison to the centuries of women's exclusion. Professor Braude's Convocation Address is entitled A Short Half-Century, 50 Years of Women at Harvard Divinity School. And we are looking forward to your critical feminist historical explorations. Please welcome with me Professor Anne Braude.
Thank you very much. President Summers, Dean Graham, esteemed colleagues, honored guests, students and faculty of the Divinity School, new and old, it is a great pleasure to address you on this wonderful occasion. I'm particularly honored by the presence today of those of you who were here in 1955 when women first enrolled as students. This is your day, not mine. For some of us who were not here, 1955 may seem long ago, part of an archaic past of the Cold War, McCarthyism, and racial segregation. But for those who remember 1955, or for any of us who take a long historical view, these 50 years may seem short indeed, just more than a quarter of this school's life. The fact that women have been admitted for such a brief period might well cause embarrassment or amusement rather than celebration. Of course, women have always been here, that is, since the founding of the school in 1816. As staff, family members, and supporters, women have cleaned the toilets, run the library, edited manuscripts, given money, and 100 other things. But only in 1955 did we join the school's raison d'etre, matriculated students. Harvard Divinity School was hardly a pioneer. Among our peer institutions, some have admitted women for 100 years and more. Even at Harvard, the Divinity School was among the last graduate and professional schools to open its doors, though able Radcliffe students, I hasten to add, found their way into our classes one way or another. When it finally occurred, the admission of women was unremarkable. I asked one of the earliest women students how she learned that HDS admitted women. She said, "I assumed they did. I never gave it a thought." While women's admission may appear a non-event in and of itself, it advanced the plot of a larger story, a story going back to Harvard's origins when, as Peter Gomes has observed, the crisis of authority caused by Anne Hutchison's theological perspicacity added urgency to the magistrate's concern to educate a cadre of learned men, learned enough to best her intimate knowledge of the Bible and defeat her agile antinomianism. The story goes back still further when, as Karen King observes, the men who hoped to hold tight the reins of authority in the emerging structures of early Christianity discredited women apostles whose teachings and existence called for more inclusive notions of sacrality. And the story continues today when America's largest religious groups, the Roman Catholic Church and the Southern Baptist Convention, continue to view women as disqualified by nature or by Scripture from the most important religious roles. Indeed, it is this longer, larger story that made women's admission to HDS so difficult and so long in coming, and that makes its jubilee worthy of celebration. In this longer view, Harvard's decades of delay seem brief indeed, and may even serve to clarify the significance of women's presence in a way that can help us become the school we strive to be. To sharpen our focus on the significance of women's presence, let us revisit 3 moments in our history, one before women were admitted and one after, as well as that day 50 years ago when women first sat in this assembly. At each point, I'd like to explore with you what the presence or absence of women tells us about the perennial question at the heart of this school's identity, the appropriate relation of the academic study of religion and the professional training of religious leaders. And during my relatively brief tenure on this faculty, I have variously heard this issue referred to as a stimulating topic of intellectual exchange, as a somewhat contentious debate, and as a crisis. I was much reassured to find heated discussion of this topic going back 100 years. Today, I'd like to explore how debates about the presence of women at Harvard Divinity School and debates about the mission and curriculum of the school, debates about the mission of the school and the content and goals of its curriculum shed light on each other. Let us look through the lens of gender at the school in which all of us have chosen to pursue our various vocations, to see what it can tell us, both about our past and about our future. The moment I'd like to visit first occurred in 1893. This was a heady year for religious liberals. The World's Parliament of Religions at the Columbian Exhibition in Chicago attempted to realize incipient ideals of pluralism and progress with all their 19th century limitations. Down the midway at the largely present University of Chicago, with a divinity school at its center, the school opened in that year as a fully coeducational institution. Alumni of Harvard Divinity School chose this moment to petition the Board of Overseers to admit women students. A near neighbor, Hartford Seminary, was well into its first decade of coeducation and released an upbeat report on theological training for women. The committee charged to respond to the Harvard alumni petition noted that, quote, "There are many women now preaching in various denominations, and it is clearly of importance that such women should receive adequate instruction before entering the ministry. Nonetheless, they found it unwise and impracticable. to grant the petition because in many courses, graduates and undergraduates of the college outnumber the Divinity School men, in some courses forming a very large proportion of the class. In 1893, this was enough to doom the proposal, because the undesirability of women in college courses was the pillar of Harvard's policies towards women's education. It dictated the novel form of the Annex, later known as Radcliffe College, in which women heard the same lectures delivered by the same faculty as Harvard men, but at different times and places. Charles William Eliot, the president who transformed Harvard from a strong regional college into a world leader, was firm on this issue. While we here are beneficiaries of President Eliot's wisdom, his attitudes towards women demonstrate its limits. He opposed the presence of women in Harvard classrooms precisely because he wanted to broaden the pool of men for the academic meritocracy, including, with limits, the sons of immigrants, non-Christians, and Catholics. Coeducation does very well in communities where persons are more on an equality, he wrote, but in a large city where persons of all classes are thrown together, it works badly. Unpleasant associations are formed, and disastrous marriages often result. Coeducation might be okay where students shared a single faith, like at Methodist Boston University, but not at an institution where, thanks to the elective system inspired by Eliot's Unitarian rationalism, young minds were free to explore. Broad and Emersonian in outlook, Eliot made Harvard one of the first universities to abolish mandatory chapel and help the Divinity School live up to the non-sectarian principles on which it had been founded. President Eliot unburdened himself on the topic of women's education at the inauguration of Caroline Hazard as the president of Wellesley College. The Quaker president of Bryn Mawr, M. Carey Thomas, sat in the audience, bedecked in academic regalia. Eliot's speech, she recalled, made me hot from head to foot. He described the education of women as an experiment, wondering aloud about women's intellectual capacities and about the ability of women's colleges to inculcate good manners while providing an education that would not injure women's bodily powers and functions. When gender entered the picture, Eliot's views on the role of religion in education changed entirely. Harvard men, Eliot believed, both in the college and the Divinity School, should be free to worship or not as their conscience dictated, and should take a historical approach to the study of religion. The university should impart knowledge and foster moral development so that the individual could choose the right. Wellesley women, in contrast, should have their religious motives and aspirations shaped by the college, and particularly by the, quote, simplicity, dignity, and intellectual strenuousness of congregational worship, where vain repetitions are avoided and the gregarious religious excitement so unwholesome for young women finds no place. And that's congregational with a capital C. This gender dynamic, in which the practice of religion, the continuity of tradition, and the benefits of religious authority are associated with women for whom higher education may be injurious, and the critical study of religion is associated with men for whom its practice is a private matter, provides an important backdrop for understanding what would transpire in subsequent decades. In addition, as we move on in our history, let us note the buried insight in President Eliot's anxieties about class mixing and unpleasant associations. His fears suggest that the admission of women connected in complicated ways with religious and ethnic diversity and had the potential to increase its impact. It would take 60 years and many ups and downs in the life of the Divinity School for the alumni proposal of 1893 to be accepted by the Harvard Corporation. We now leap to the Convocation of 1955, when women first sat as students in this assembly. The 8 women degree candidates in the audience were a remarkable group. They included Letty Russell, who's here with us today, who would go on to be one of the first women ordained in the United Presbyterian Church, one of the first Christian feminist theologians, and would serve for over 25 years on the faculty of Yale Divinity School. They included Constance Parvey on our platform party, who would be one of the first women ordained in the Lutheran Church and would produce the famous Sheffield Report on the community of men and women in the churches for the World Council of Churches, and would serve for many years as chaplain at MIT. The group included Judith Haler, ordained as a Unitarian Universalist, who would become one of the first denominational counselors at the school. The brilliant Marianka Fusek, who would distinguish herself as a scholar of the Roman world, was the only THD candidate in the group. And the inimitable Eleanor Bunn Thompson came as a student and then virtually ran the school when a succession of deans relied on her expertise as an editor and administrator. Emily Thornton Gage, a transfer student from Union Theological Seminary, would be the first woman to receive an HDS degree in 1957. At that convocation in 1955, the newly appointed dean, Douglas Horton, chided the school for its tardiness in admitting women by remarking at the mumbling and head-shaking that accompanied the admission of Anna Maria Schumann to study theology at the Frisian University in Holland 300 years before. He noted that Harvard Divinity School in 1955 was adopting the thesis Schumann defended in her 17th century dissertation that the study of letters is becoming to a Christian woman. Trained at the coeducational Hartford Seminary, Douglas Horton, following the death of his first wife, wed the 45-year-old president of Wellesley College, Mildred McAfee, a prominent lay leader in the Congregational Church. Many early women students lived with the Hortons on the third floor of Jewett House. If any of them wanted a model for breaking gender barriers, Mildred McAfee Horton specialized in just that. During World War II, she took leave from her presidency to become the first woman commissioned officer in the Navy as director of the Waves. She excelled in electrical engineering, serving as the first female member of the board of directors of both RCA and NBC. And she broke barriers in religion, where she served as the first woman vice president of the Federal Council of Churches. When asked her husband's opinion at a committee meeting, she replied, "I really don't know what it is. He is at home doing the breakfast dishes so that I could attend this meeting." In this environment, the admission of women could hardly be questioned. The Dean's Report of 1955 states only that the corporation accepted the recommendation of the faculty. I suspect that the faculty might have recommended it long before that if there had been one. But in the 1940s, HDS had been a near moribund institution with a part-time dean and a limited curriculum delivered primarily by FAS faculty. Interestingly, keeping women out in the 1940s merited more attention in the dean's reports than did letting them in the 1950s. Indulge me, if you will, while I quote from the 1949 report of Dean Willard Sperry. "The question of the admission of women," he wrote, "is one that has come up often over the last 25 years and is sure to be reopened in the future, particularly in view of their recent admission by the law school and the medical school." Defending Harvard's standards of excellence, he observed, "Most women divinity students devote themselves to the field of religious education, presumably proposing to become employed in Sunday schools. We have no department of religious education as such, and there is at this moment no inclination to organize such a department, even had we means to do so." Further, he noted, "One cannot wholly escape the rather ungenerous suspicion that many a young woman enters divinity school with the unsuspected hope that she may become a minister's wife. Whether or not women are going to be welcome and effective as parish ministers," he continued, "is not a problem which we can decide. That decision will have to be made by trial and error in the churches." He concluded with remarkable candor, I have no convictions and no wisdom on this matter. It's in the dean's report. I didn't make it up. While President Eliot feared coeducation would cause poor marriages, Dean Sperry feared it might lead to good ones, at least by the standards of his day. His comments recall the binary association of women with religious practice and men with religious ideas. Sperry's dismissal of women's place in theological education mirrored a view of the school's mission as merely academic. The Divinity School of his day offered no professional training in ministry or even academic training in the fields of theology or ethics in the modern world. The school was not viewed as having a transformative or leading role in religion or society, or even within theological education. Rather, it provided a service to religious groups who needed leaders educated in Bible and in Christian history and doctrine. It was not a place where new questions could be raised about the future or the past, and where the tools of critical inquiry could be used to answer them. This latter view of the school, in which faculty modeled intellectual innovation and its application in national and international conversations and professional contexts, would come to the fore in the 1950s, when the Divinity School was reborn under the presidency of Nathan Pusey, the deanship of Douglas Horton, and the financial support of David Rockefeller. In 1955, women entered a school staffed by a youthful cadre of brilliant international scholars who felt the full support of their dean and president. By the end of the 1950s, 3 changes marked the beginning of Harvard Divinity School's modern history: the admission of women, the founding of the Center for the Study of World Religions, and the establishment of the Department of the Church, which would eventually become today's Office of Ministry Studies. Apparently unconnected, each marked a stream in the intersecting intellectual currents that would shape the school we now attend. The women joined in the excitement of the revitalized school. They were inspired by the leadership of their professors in encouraging a social role for the churches, as well as by their professors' participation in the international ecumenical movement that would train a key generation of leaders in civil rights and social justice. But women soon disappeared from the dean's reports. While Douglas Horton at least spoke appreciatively of wives of students and faculty who had formal roles in the school during the 1950s, in the 1960s, women are not mentioned at all. The school had done an about-face since the non-activist days of the 1940s. New departments of theology, ethics, and comparative religion brought stringent moral analysis to contemporary social issues. The school courted controversy with conferences on sexual ethics and abortion, and conducted a colloquium in Washington, D.C., where students participated in a debate over black power between SNCC and the NAACP, and attended congressional hearings on the Civil Rights Act. While a summer program began to encourage able African American undergraduates to enter the ministry, a faculty report found that white concerns, attitudes, and habits pervade the life and curriculum of the school, and the Student Black Caucus found the faculty report to be based upon racist paternalist assumptions. Harvey Cox published The Proto-Feminist Secular City in 1965, and Joseph Fichter, the Stillman Professor of Roman Catholic Studies, offered the school's first course on women in the church in 1967, before blurbing Mary Daly's 1969 book, The Church and the Second Sex, as the most sophisticated, the most progressive, and the most honest of all the works that have attempted to deal with women in the church. Harvard Divinity School was, by all accounts, in the words of one alum, a happening place. Yet it consisted almost exclusively of men, with no women on the faculty and only 2 or 3 graduating each year. Then, in 1970, the tide began to turn. 35 women enrolled, almost as many as had graduated during the previous 15 years. The catalog of that year read, The Divinity School considers it important to encourage women to seek theological education, including preparation for the ordained ministry. Justice, as well as the need for a wider spectrum of human experience in the leadership of the churches, calls for an increased number of women at all levels of theological education. Further developments, the catalog explained, depend upon the availability of women prepared for pioneering service. The following year, 56 women enrolled, most in the new Master of Theological Studies degree, a number in the doctoral programs, but with a critical mass preparing for ordination in the Master of Divinity. At this moment, when feminism arose as a major force in American society and thought, three conditions made the Divinity School fertile soil for its flourishing and for the establishment of the university's first women's studies program: the deanship of Krister Stendahl, the presence of a talented and astute group of women students who founded the Women's Caucus, and third, the mission and structure of the school itself, with its combined commitments to the critical study of religion and to its practice, to multicultural education, and to putting theological analysis to work in social settings. Here was a place where scholars were accountable to the living communities from which students came and to which they returned. And in every one of those communities, the religious leadership of women was far more than a question of access to education. It required a fundamental rethinking of the meaning of texts, doctrines, practices, and history in a way that was not required by women's entrance into most professional schools. The feminist assertion that the personal is political echoed through the curriculum as students and faculty sought to understand the nature, content, and repercussions of faith commitments and practices, their own and others. Dean Stendahl, affectionately known as Sister Krister by women students, was already on record supporting the ordination of women as a biblical scholar before coming to Harvard from Sweden in 1954. He had married not a college president, but another theological scholar, Britta Johnson, whose father had introduced the motion for the ordination of women in the State Church of Sweden into the Swedish Parliament. Against the consensus of biblical scholars, Krister Stendahl argued that the New Testament did not speak to the issue directly in a piece that was instrumental to the successful vote in the Swedish Parliament. While the Hortons provided support for women's leadership in unconventional arenas, the Stendahls were the right people at the right time to support a new innovation arising from women students: the use of gender as a category of analysis in scholarly research, women's studies. In the fall of 1971, the Women's Caucus, consisting of women students, staff, and wives of faculty and students, began meeting weekly. 2 students from the caucus responded to an assignment in Harvey Cox's course on eschatology and politics, with a proposal to devote 2 weeks of the course to women's liberation and to halt the use of the masculine pronouns to refer to all people or to God in class discussions. Professor Cox submitted the proposal to the class. The 80 students voted both to focus on readings and discussion of women's liberation and to try the experiment with language. The instructional budget paid for the kazoos class members blew when they heard gender-exclusive language. We chose kazoos because it made the class as a whole responsible, one student recalled. Nobody wanted to be the language police, and everyone loved the phallic symbolism. After class member E.J. Dion reported the story on the front page of the Crimson, Newsweek picked it up. HDS students trained in the analysis of texts, rituals, and doctrines were attuned to subtle and not so subtle repercussions of naming, classification, and symbolic action. When they turned their analysis to gender, the school would never be the same, and neither would the world. That same term, women students invited Mary Daly to Linda Barafaldi's dorm room to discuss the invitation Daly had received to be the first woman ever to preach at Harvard's Memorial Church. It was there that Daly, with the Harvard students' encouragement, conceived the walkout from patriarchal religion that she led on November 14th. When Daly descended the pulpit of Memorial Church and invited others to join her in walking out, some Divinity School women followed her out of the church, never to return. Some followed her in an act of love and anger that would make it possible for them to walk back in on their own terms, and others remained inside, committed to using what they learned to reform institutions to which they remained loyal. Differences fueled passionate arguments among allies. Excuse me. Roman Catholic women studied together with women who could be ordained. Those committed to ordination studied with those who rejected it as patriarchal, and those who came to the school to study religion but not to practice it confronted the value of faith in the lives of other students. Somehow, one student recalled, what everybody was bringing was combustible. Lack of difference also proved to be combustible. The Women's Caucus modeled itself on the Black Caucus. Participants were conscious of both the similarity of agendas and the possibility that the groups could be used against each other. In 1971, women and African Americans each comprised approximately 11% of the student body. One student recalled that the Black Caucus was all male and the Women's Caucus was all white because there were no African American students at HDS. This was not quite true. The handful of black women who began to matriculate in the late 60s usually identified more with black students than with other women, even though many black male students opposed the ordination of women and told them so. One of the first African American women to receive the Master's of Divinity degree, Babette Reed Kahn, had been the first black woman to graduate from Williams College and would be the second ordained in the Episcopal Church after Pauli Murray. After 1 year of doctoral study in Hebrew Bible, she left Harvard never to return. I loved the Old Testament, she told me, but I never wanted to be another first. You have no idea how hard it is. Rena Karifa Smart, who I believe to be the first African American woman to earn the theological doctorate from Harvard in 1976, had also been the first black woman to graduate from Yale Divinity School 30 years before. During the 1970s, the percent of women students would increase yearly until women were a majority by the early 80s and have stayed that way, while the percent of African American students leveled and sometimes declined. Dean Stendahl provided funds for a number of women students to travel to annual meetings of the American Academy of Religion, where they helped found the Women and Religion section. A number of their term papers were published in anthologies produced by that group, including Emily Culpepper's essays on menstrual taboos in Leviticus and in Zoroastrianism. Concluding that she could spend the rest of her life analyzing negative attitudes towards menstruation, Culpepper decided to explore the subject from a positive viewpoint in her MDiv thesis. Graduation requirements called for either a private examination or a public disputation of the thesis. Culpepper chose the public disputation. Her thesis consisted of a 10-minute color film entitled Period Piece, intended to provide an alternative to conscious and unconscious versions of President Eliot's concern that a conflict existed between the demands of higher educations and women's bodily powers and functions. The Sperry room was packed. One student recalled sitting between two professors who were chattering away in German, forgetting that they had required her to learn the language. My mother would roll over in her grave one professor said to the other in German as the film alternated images of women divinity students engaged in serious intellectual activity with images of those same students inserting tampons and performing self-examinations. And let me just interject here that the Harvard Divinity School students who will be performing the vagina monologues as part of our 50th anniversary celebration are part of a long and proud tradition at the school. The Dean's Report of 1972 indicates that Jean McRae, a second-year student who would soon found the New Words Feminist Bookstore, was appointed as the first coordinator of women's programs. When I mentioned this to Jean, she said, "I guess my name was the one that was put down. This was a collective effort." The coordinator of women's programs, a position that would for many years be filled by another Women's Caucus member, Brinton Likes, was located in the recently established Office of Ministry Studies, where the first director, Patricia Budd Kepler, and most of her successors would be women. Excitement about path-breaking women's ministries enlivened the project of professional formation, opening an array of new possibilities for men and women. In response to proposals from the Women's Caucus, Alice Hageman came to the school in 1972 as the Lentz Lecturer on Women and Ministry, and together with students published a volume entitled Sexist Religion and Women in the Church, No More Silences, based on 14 guest lectures at the school that year. Rosemary Ruther came to HDS on the Stillman Chair and offered the first course on feminist theology. Out of these experiences came a successful proposal from the Women's Caucus for what would eventually become the Women's Studies in Religion program. Initially known as the Research Resource Associates in Women's Studies, the program brought 5 scholars to the school each year with the modest assignment of transforming the sources, methods, and conclusions of the fields of study comprising the curriculum. The initial student proposal, authorized by faculty vote on February 16, 1973, which is when we'll be performing the vagina monologues, provided that the group will be interracial in order to represent the experience of both black and white women. Not yet attentive to religious diversity, the program in its early years nevertheless brought a stream of African American scholars, including formative figures in womanist theology, Jacqueline Grant and Katie Geneva Cannon. They helped attract a dynamic cohort of students who would make black women an important presence during the 1980s, including Karen Baker Fletcher, who will deliver this year's William James Lecture, and Chandra Taylor Smith, our immediate past president of the Alumni Association. But now I have entered the 1980s, beyond the story I promised to tell, and history teaches that I ought not exceed the allotted time. I note Professor Gomes is not here. Thus, I shall have to forego speaking of the first women faculty, Caroline Walker Bynum and Jane Smith, of the remarkable contributions of Associate Dean Constance Buchanan, of the tenuring of the first woman professor, Margaret Miles, in 1983, of the conference Diana Eck convened in the same year on women, religion, and social change, in which 70 women from around the world gathered at the Center for the Study of World Religion. Nor can I speak of the first woman appointed to a named chair in 1988, when the feminist biblical scholar Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza became Krister Stendahl Professor of Divinity. Today is the Jubilee of women students, so they have been our focus. It is because of their imagination, intelligence, and hard work that women's studies came to this school. Now 1/3 of our faculty teach and publish in the field of gender, many of them graduates of the school or former advisors or scholars of our women's studies program. Perhaps the most important lesson of viewing the history of our school through the lens of gender has to do with the intellectual benefits of being an outsider. If you feel like an outsider to this august institution, you are in very good company. Almost everyone I know feels like an outsider here, either because of their religious commitments or their lack of them, Because of the particular background and vantage from which they approach the study of religion, their disciplinary commitments, their national origin, their race, their sexual orientation, or all of the above. Participants in the Women's Caucus wore their outsiderhood proudly. They trumpeted it from kazoos, displayed it on panels in the hallways, and projected it on the screens of the Sperry Room. Certainly, the critical mass of women students enabled them to overcome the most painful aspects of isolation. Their path may not, or may not yet, be open to all students. Yet their sense of outsiderhood enlivened conversations, fueled creativity, and engendered a profound level of commitment to the school. They proved many times over Virginia Woolf's observation about the admission of women to British universities, that it is better to be locked out than to be locked in. This is a sentiment with which any intellectual can agree, but it has a particular salience at this school which makes the audacious claim to study religion from a non-sectarian viewpoint, a mission that challenges us daily to consider the ways in which we may still be locked in. Every religion accounts for gender as part of a created order, and we all live with the repercussions. Religion's role in constructing, maintaining, distorting, and subverting gender is played out every day in the headlines and in homes and schools and places of worship throughout the world, in debates over birth control, abortion, family violence that spill into both domestic and foreign policy, in debates about the Iraqi Constitution and the American invasion of Afghanistan, about the nature of marriage, about health, law, development, and globalization. We at Harvard Divinity School have chosen to be actors rather than bystanders in this drama, by taking gender as an arena for critical investigation rather than as a given. While we have much less to do, we pause today to celebrate what we have accomplished in this short half-century. Thank you.
Religion, a poem by Pam Wynne. I grew up in this house. It's heavy and dark. The ground on which it stands is beginning to cave in. When it rains, the foundation leaks. I watch and pray for a rainbow. Once the walls were very familiar, comforting, but now the rooms feel small and cramped, moldy and gray. It's been remodeled time and time again, but the basic structure remains the same. Old material, still functional, beautiful. But I want something spacious with warmth and light. I am drawn to houses in the East. But I live here in the hallways of its history, lined with age-old manuscripts,
full of architectural plans. I ripped them apart page by page, searching for a house without walls.
A convocation calls us together, and I would hope that after this convocation, the vocare part of convocare will come back to call you all together on each of the occasions this year when others will try to follow in the rather formidable footsteps of our colleague Anne Braude in exploring issues of women and religion throughout the year. All of our named lectures this year and many of our other programs will be focused on this particular theme. It is a theme and an area of study of which we are justly, I think, immensely proud in this faculty and in this school. And I call upon all of you to answer this call, and let's make this year another year of explorations along new frontiers in an area that is so crucial to all of us. For the immediate moment, I simply remind you that we will be called together again in a few minutes back under the tent in front of Andover Hall for those who would join us in our post-convocation reception there. Thank you all and good evening.